Hattie Mercer climbed over the corral rail just as the black stallion crushed a grown man's arm against the post and left him screaming in the dirt. Every soul in Red Bluff went still. The fat stable girl they mocked, the woman no man would marry, walked straight at the killer horse with her bare hands open and her voice low. "Easy now," she breathed. The beast reared over her. She didn't flinch. And from the shadow of the mercantile, a mountain man named Gideon Hale watched the only person who had ever made him stop walking. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end. These stories only reach where you carry them. And tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight so I can see just how far Hattie's story has traveled. Now let's begin. The stallion's hooves came down where Hattie's skull had been a half-second before. She'd already shifted her weight slow as river silt, and the iron-shod feet bit the dirt instead. "You damn fool, girl." Sheriff Del Crawford had his boot up on the rail, but he didn't climb over. None of them ever climbed over. "Get out of there before he kills you too." "He ain't killed nobody yet," Hattie said, not turning her head. "He's scared. There's a difference." Tell that to Tom Egan's arm. Tom Egan went at him with a quirt. She kept her eyes soft off the horse's eyes on his shoulder, the way her father taught her before the fever took him. You whip a frightened thing, it learns you're the thing to be frightened of. Then it does what frightened things do. The horse blew hard through his nose, a sound like a bellows, and backed himself into the far corner of the corral. 40 people stood at the rails of the Red Bluff stockyard, and not one of them made a sound now. They'd come for a show. Somebody had said the fat Mercer girl was going to try and gentle the black devil that old man Pruitt couldn't sell, and that was worth leaving the washwater and the Saturday accounts for. They'd expected to laugh. They were used to laughing at Hattie Mercer. They weren't laughing now. "That's 300 pounds of mean," a voice drawled from the rail. Curtis Vane. He owned the freight line and half the notes in town, and he liked to talk most where he knew the least. "And about 200 pounds of woman fixing to get herself stomped flat. Somebody ought to fetch her brother." A few of them tittered then. Not many. The danger had taken the fun out of it. Hattie heard the words the way she'd heard 10,000 like them since she was a girl. They landed somewhere far off in a part of her she'd built thick and quiet like a stable wall packed with straw against the cold. Too big. Too plain. Too much. She'd been 7 years old the first time a grown woman looked at her and clicked her tongue with pity. And she was 28 now, and the looks had never stopped, only changed their flavor. Pity when she was young. Scorn when she filled out. And now, when she walked the streets of Red Bluff at full-grown height, with shoulders broad as a man's, and a body the town had decided was a sin against good order, a kind of disgust they didn't even bother to hide. She let it land far off, and she kept walking the horse. "Easy," she said again soft. "Easy, big man. Nobody's got a whip. Nobody's got nothing. It's just you and me, and I got all day." She did have all day. That was the secret nobody understood. Men wanted a horse broke by sundown because they had places to be and pride to feed. Hattie had no place. Anybody wanted her, and her pride had been kicked out of her a long time ago, and so she had the one thing a frightened animal needed more than anything on earth. She had time, and she had no fear, because the worst thing the horse could do to her was kill her, and the town did worse than that to her every single day, and called it being neighborly. The stallion's ears flicked forward, just once, just for a breath. "There he is," she murmured. "There's the smart one. You've been letting everybody think you're stupid 'cause it's safer. I know that trick. I do it too." It took her 2 hours. 2 hours of standing and turning her shoulder and breathing and saying nothing that mattered in a voice that mattered more than the words. The crowd thinned, because crowds always thin when the thing they came to mock turns into something they can't. By the time the black horse pressed his velvet nose into her open palm and let her run her hand up the length of his jaw, there were maybe a dozen left, and most of those had gone quiet in a way that shamed them, though they'd never have said so. When she finally led him on a loose lead to the gate, the horse following her like a dog, an old rancher named Bill Hardesty took off his hat. Took it clean off his head the way a man does at a funeral or in a church. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I been around horses 60 years. I never seen the like." He just needed somebody to be still, Hattie said. "No, ma'am." Hardesty turned his hat in his hands. "He needed you." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a year, and it caught her so off guard that her throat went tight and she had to look down at the dirt to keep her face from doing something it had no business doing in front of people. She handed the lead to Pruitt without a word and climbed back over the rail and walked toward the livery with her chin up and her eyes burning. And behind her she heard Curtis Vane say low, but not low enough, "Shame all that talent's wasted on a heifer." And the laughter came back, easy as breathing. It always came back. What Hattie did not know, what not one soul in that stockyard knew, was that a man had stood in the long shadow of the mercantile for the whole 2 hours, and he had not laughed once. Gideon Hale had come down off the mountain for mules and salt and lead, and he meant to be gone before dark. He didn't truck with towns. Towns were where men talked too much and meant too little, where a fellow's word was worth whatever the next fellow could squeeze out of it. He'd buried a wife and a daughter 11 years gone up high, where the snow took them both in the same hard winter, and he had come down off that mountain a different man than the one who'd gone up. He spoke about 4 sentences a day, mostly to mules, and he liked it that way. He had stopped to watch the horse out of professional habit. A trapper that high up lived and died by his stock. A man learned to read an animal the way other men read a Bible, and he'd seen straight off that the black was a good horse made bad by bad handling, the kind most folks would put a bullet in and call it mercy. Then the fat girl came over the rail and Gideon Hale forgot all about the mules. He watched her the way he watched weather coming over a ridge. He saw her read the horse. He saw her give up her fear, like a man laying down a heavy pack, and he saw the horse feel it the second she did. He'd known maybe 3 men in his whole life who could do what she did, and all 3 were dead, and none of them had been able to do it the way she did it, not with a trick or a rope, but with something underneath all that, something patient and unbroken and bottomless. And he'd heard what they called her. Every ugly word. He stood in the shadow and he listened to a whole town spit on the most capable hand he'd ever seen, with stock. And something in his chest, something he'd thought had frozen solid 11 winters back, cracked just slightly, the way river ice cracks in the first false thaw. When she walked off and they laughed, Gideon Hale found that his jaw had gone tight enough to ache. He did not go to her then. He was not a man who did things quickly. He went and bought his salt and his lead, and he stood at the counter of the mercantile, and he listened, because in a town, the best way to learn a thing is to buy from a man who likes to talk, and the mercantile keeper, a thin, nervous fellow named Asa Bell, liked to talk plenty. "That horse gentling," Gideon said. It was nearly the most words he'd said out loud in a month. "The big woman, Hattie Mercer." Asa Bell rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. "Lord, Caleb Mercer's sister. Caleb runs the livery, but it's her does all the work, everybody knows it. She's the one keeps that whole operation from going under, but you'd never get Caleb to say it." He leaned in like he was sharing a secret, though he said it loud enough for the whole store. "Sad case that. Pa died when she was young, Ma, not long after. Caleb took her in 'cause there wasn't nobody else, and he's never let her forget the favor. She's a hard worker, I'll grant. But who's gonna marry a thing that size? She'll die in that loft over the stalls. Mark me. Caleb's already past 30, gonna take a wife of his own one of these days. And then where's Hattie out on the street like as not? Town's got no use for her." "Town don't, huh?" Gideon said. "What's that?" "Nothing." Gideon set his coin on the counter. "How much for a man to talk to the brother about stock?" "Caleb, Lord, he'll talk your ear plumb off. He's down to the livery now, most like." Asa Bell counted the change with quick, anxious fingers. "You buying mules, he'll cheat you if he can. Watch him." "I aim to," Gideon said, and shouldered his bag and walked out into the afternoon. The Mercer livery sat at the south end of the main street where the boards ran out, and the prairie started a long, low barn with a sagging roof and a corral out back. That was, Gideon noted, the cleanest, best-kept corral in a town full of slovenly ones. Inside the stalls were swept, and the water was fresh, and the tack hung oiled on its pegs, and a man in a too-clean shirt sat tipped back in a chair by the door, with his boots up on a barrel doing nothing at all. "Help you." Caleb Mercer didn't get up. "Need mules," Gideon said. "4. Sound ones, for high country." Caleb's eyes went over Gideon's worn buckskin and his weathered face, and the rifle slung easy on his shoulder, and something greedy woke up behind them. "Mountain man, trapper." He stood now all business. "Well, you come to the right place. Got some real good stock. Real good. Come on back." He showed Gideon 4 mules, and Gideon looked at them the way a man looks at a horse trade, which is to say, he found every fault and named none of them out loud yet. 2 were sound. 1 had a hitch in his off hind that would lay him up by first snow. 1 was windbroke and would die on the first hard climb. "These 2, Gideon said, pointing. "And these other 2 are lame and broke-winded, and you know it." Caleb's grin didn't slip. "Now, friend, I'm not your friend." Gideon said it without heat. "Where's the woman?" The grin slipped then. "The what?" "The one that knows stock. I'll take her word on a mule over yours." Caleb's face did a complicated thing, anger and embarrassment, and a quick mean calculation all at once. "You mean Hattie, my sister." He said the word sister like it cost him something. "What do you want with—" He turned his head and bellowed toward the back of the barn. "Hattie, get out here." She came out of the dark of the barn, wiping her hands on a rag, and when she saw a stranger standing there, Gideon watched something go up behind her eyes like a shudder. A bracing. She'd learned to brace for strangers because a stranger was just somebody who hadn't laughed at her yet. "This here's a customer," Caleb said. "Wants your opinion on the mules for some reason." He made it sound like a foolishness. "Go on, tell him they're all sound so the man can buy and be on his way." Hattie looked at the 4 mules. She looked at them maybe 4 seconds. Then she looked at her brother, and then at the stranger, and Gideon saw her make a choice that he understood better than she could have known, the choice between a lie that kept the peace and a truth that cost her. "They ain't all sound," she said. "Hattie?" Caleb's voice dropped low and dangerous. "That one's windbroke." She nodded at the gray. "You can hear it if you stand quiet. He'll founder on the first real grade. And the bay there favors his off hind. Stone bruise gone deep, maybe worse. He's fine for flat work, but he won't last a season in the high country." She turned to Gideon, and for the first time looked him full in the face, and her chin came up a fraction defiant, expecting to be punished for it. "The 2 sorrels are good. Strong feet, deep chest kind eyes. Those'll get you up and back." The barn was dead quiet. Caleb stood there with his fists balled at his sides, his face gone red, the lie he'd been about to make pulled out from under him by his own sister in front of a paying man. And Gideon Hale, who had not smiled he could not remember how long felt the corner of his mouth want to. "I'll take the 2 sorrels," he said. "Fair price. Not the price he'd have charged me for the lame ones." "Now hold on," Caleb started, "and I'll pay her $1 for the honest word." Gideon went on as if Caleb weren't speaking. He pulled a silver dollar from his coat and held it out to Hattie. "Saved me a mule and a winter both. Worth more than $1. It's what I got." Hattie stared at the coin in his rough open palm like it might be a trick. In her whole life, Gideon would later understand, nobody had ever once paid her for the thing she was best at in the world. Caleb took the credit, the town took the work, and Hattie took the leavings. "I don't," she started. "Take it," Gideon said. "A man pays his debts." She took it. Her fingers brushed his palm, and they were strong calloused a working hand, and she pulled back fast like she'd touched a stove. "That's enough," Caleb snapped, finding his feet again. "Hattie, get back to your work. Mister, you want them sorrels, we'll settle up out front." He grabbed Hattie's arm above the elbow, harder than he needed to, and steered her toward the back of the barn, and he leaned in and hissed something at her that Gideon with a hunter's ears heard plain. "You ever make me look the fool in front of a customer again," Caleb said, "and you can find another roof. See how the town likes you out on the street." Gideon Hale stood very still by the 4 mules, and watched the brother walk away from the sister, and the cracked place in his chest opened a little wider, and into it came something he had not felt in 11 years and did not have a name for anymore. He paid for the sorrels. He paid the fair price, and not a penny under which seemed to disappoint Caleb almost as much as the lost sale. And then, instead of leading his new mules out of town toward the mountain, like a sensible man, Gideon Hale walked his stock around to the corral out back, and tied them to the rail, and sat down on an overturned bucket in the failing light. And he waited. He waited because he had spent 11 years being a man who needed nothing and nobody, and he had been certain that this was strength. And in 2 hours that afternoon, watching a despised woman stand in front of a killer horse, with her hands open and her fear laid down, he had begun to suspect it was something else. He had survived. He had not lived. There was a difference the same as the difference between a horse that was mean and a horse that was scared, and somehow the fat girl with the bottomless patience had said it out loud to a stallion without knowing she was saying it to him. Hattie found him there at dusk. She came out to fork the evening hay, and stopped dead when she saw the big mountain man sitting on her bucket in her corral, like he'd grown there. "You lost," she said. "No." "Then you're trespassing." "Reckon I am." He didn't move. "Sit a minute. I got work." "You always got work." He said it plain, no judgment in it. "Man watches you for one afternoon sees that. You do the work of 3, and they pay you in dollars they hand to your brother. Why's that?" Hattie set the hay fork down slow. Nobody asked her things. Nobody looked at her long enough to wonder. "Because it's his livery." "It's your livery," Gideon said. "He just owns the deed. That horse today knew the difference, even if the town don't." He nodded at the bucket across from him. "Sit. I'm not gonna bite, and I'm not gonna laugh, and I'm not selling nothing. I just got a thing to ask, and I'd as soon ask it sitting down." Something in the flat steadiness of his voice was so unlike every other voice that had ever spoken to her, that Hattie, against every instinct she'd built since she was 7 years old, sat down on the bucket across from him. Up close, he was older than she'd thought gray coming in at the temples. His face seamed and hard, but his eyes were steady, and they didn't slide off her the way folks' eyes always did. They stayed. It was unnerving being looked at like she was a person worth the looking. "What's the thing you got to ask?" she said warily. Gideon Hale was quiet a long moment. He was not a man who'd ever been good with words, even when he used to use them, and he'd just spent 11 years not using them. And so when he finally spoke, he said it the only way he knew, which was straight and plain, and without a single ornament to soften the blow. "I lost my wife and my girl up on that mountain 11 winters back," he said. "Snow took them while I was running my line. Came home to 2 graves I had to dig myself in, ground froze like iron. I've run that line alone ever since, and I've done all right. But a man my age alone up high, he's one busted leg from being a frozen corpse come spring. And I need stock handled, and I need a partner that won't quit when it gets bad, and I have not in 11 years met one single soul I'd trust at my back on that mountain." He stopped. Hattie waited, not breathing. "Till today," Gideon said. The dark had come down full now, and a coyote sang somewhere out on the prairie, and Hattie Mercer sat on a bucket in a corral she didn't own, and felt her heart going like a trapped bird in her chest. "You want to hire me?" she said. "As a hand?" "No." Gideon turned his hat slowly in his big scarred hands, the same gesture old Hardesty had made that afternoon, the gesture a man makes when he's about to say a thing that matters. "A hand can quit. A hand's brother can take her back. A hand's town can run her off. I've got no use for a thing that can be taken from me, ma'am. I've had enough taken." He lifted his eyes to hers and held them. "I'm asking you to marry me." Hattie laughed. It came out before she could stop it, a hard, hurt, disbelieving bark, because the only time in her whole life a man had spoken of marrying her, it had been a joke meant to make a barroom roar, and she had learned a long time ago that to hope was to hand somebody a stick to beat you with. "That's a cruel joke, mister," she said, and her voice shook, and she hated that it shook. "Even for this town. You go on back wherever you—" "It's not a joke." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice, she would learn. "And it's not romance neither, so you can put that fear down too. I'm too old and too broke inside for that. It's a deal. A contract plain as the one I'd make for the mules. You come up the mountain as my wife in name in law, where your brother can't reach you, and this town can't touch you. You handle the stock, which God knows you can do better than any man I ever met. I keep you fed and warm, and I never once raise a hand or a hard word to you on my mother's grave. And in the spring, if you want gone, you're gone with stock and supplies enough to start fresh anywhere. There's no Curtis Vane to laugh at you." He set his hat back on his head. "That's the whole of it. No tricks underneath." Hattie Mercer sat in the dark and could not speak. Because the cruelest thing about the offer was that it was kind, and she did not know how to hold a kind thing. She had hands that could gentle a killer stallion, and she had no earthly idea what to do with a man who looked at her and saw not a heifer, not a burden, not a joke, but the most capable person he'd met in 11 years of surviving where soft folks died. "Why me?" she finally managed, and it came out small, smaller than she'd been in years. "You could find a small wife, a pretty one the town would—" "I don't want one the town would," Gideon said, and there was iron under it. "I watched that town today. I watched them laugh at the best hand with stock I have ever in my life laid eyes on. And I watched you walk into a killer's pen and lay down your fear and gentle him in 2 hours when grown men would have shot him. The town's a fool, ma'am. Every last one of them. I've buried smarter men than the whole population of Red Bluff." He stood, and he was very tall in the dark, and he looked down at her, not with pity and not with scorn, but with something steadier and rarer than both. "I don't need pretty. Pretty don't keep a mule alive at 12,000 feet. I need the best, and you're the best, and they were too blind to keep you. Their loss. I aim to make it my gain, if you'll have it." Out in the barn, a door slammed. Caleb's voice came rough across the dark. "Hattie, you out here, supper's cold, and I ain't waiting on you all night." Hattie flinched at the sound of it, an old flinch, a whole lifetime of flinching folded up in her shoulders. And Gideon Hale saw the flinch, and his weathered face went hard as the mountain he lived on. "That," he said quietly, "is what I'm offering to take you away from. You don't got to answer tonight. I'll be camped at the river crossing 2 days buying my salt and shoeing my stock. Reckon on it." He touched his hat brim, the smallest gesture, but he did it the way Hardesty had taken his whole hat off, like she was somebody owed respect. "Evening, Miss Mercer." He untied his 2 good sorrels and led them out of the corral and into the dark. And Hattie Mercer sat alone on an overturned bucket, with a silver dollar still clenched in her fist, so hard it had left a coin-shaped mark in her palm, listening to her brother bellow her name into the night like she was a dog that had run off. And for the first time in 28 years of being the woman nobody wanted, she let herself do the most dangerous thing she knew how to do. She let herself wonder what it might be like to be wanted. The coin was warm from her grip. The mountain man's voice still sat in her ears, plain and steady, and entirely unlike a joke. "The town's a fool, ma'am. Every last one of them." And out in the barn, Caleb hollered a third time meaner now, and Hattie Mercer stood up off that bucket, slow the way she stood up to a frightened horse, and she did not call back, and she did not hurry. And something old and bent inside her began very quietly to straighten. The silver dollar was still in her fist when Hattie walked into the kitchen and Caleb was already talking. "Where in God's name were you? I've been hollering till I'm hoarse." He sat hunched over cold beans, not looking at her. "That mountain man, pay up." He paid. "How much?" "Fair price. For the 2 sorrels." Caleb's spoon stopped. "I told you to tell him they was all sound." He set the spoon down slow. "You cost me 2 mules, Hattie. Lame mules I'd have been shut of. You know what a lame mule eats in a winter? You just gave that food away 'cause you couldn't keep your mouth shut. They'd have died on him up high." She kept her voice flat, the voice she used on a spooked animal. "He'd have known it come from us. Then nobody this side of the river buys a Mercer mule again." It was good sense, and Caleb knew it was good sense, and that was exactly why it lit him. A man can stand being wrong. He can't stand his sister being right where a customer can see. "Don't you tell me how to run my livery." He stood up so fast the chair barked across the floor. My livery, my name on the deed. You sleep in my loft, and you eat my beans, and you act like the place falls down without you. He came around the table. It don't fall down without you, Hattie. You'd do well to remember that. Plenty of girls would be grateful for a roof. You're the only one too proud to say thank you for it. She'd heard it all 100 times. It still found the soft place. It always found the soft place. That was the cruelty of a brother, that he'd known her since she was small enough to carry. And so he knew exactly where the soft place was. I say thank you every day, Caleb, she said quietly. I say it with my hands. From dawn till dark. Don't get clever. He pointed a finger at her face. You think you're too good for this town. That's your trouble. You always have. Pa filled your head with it all that horse whispering nonsense like it made you somebody. It don't. You know what you are without me. You're a fat woman with no husband and no prospects and no place. That's what the world sees. That's all it sees. He sat back down and pulled his beans toward him. Now, there's a man fixing to take a wife in this town, and you'd best mind yourself because, come the day I marry, there ain't gonna be room in that loft for you and a bride both. So you'd better learn some gratitude quick, or you'll learn the street. There it was. The thing Isabel had said in the mercantile said out loud now in her own brother's kitchen. Out on the street like as not. And Hattie Mercer, who had swallowed 10,000 cruelties, because there had never been anywhere else to put them, opened her hand under the table and looked down at the silver dollar a stranger had pressed into her palm for the honest word. A man pays his debts. What if I had a place? She said. Caleb laughed around his beans. You? A place. What if a man offered to marry me? He laughed harder, and it was the laugh she'd heard her whole life. The barroom laugh, the laugh that turned her into a joke to make the room warm. But there was something underneath it this time, a thread of unease, because Caleb knew his sister, and he knew she didn't say things she didn't mean. What man, he said, and it had stopped being funny in his mouth, even as he laughed. The mountain man. The spoon went down. The laugh died all the way. Caleb stared at her, and across his face went a whole flock of feelings she could read, like she read a horse. Disbelief, then a flash of something almost like fear, then quick and ugly, the thing that always won in Caleb, which was calculation. He never, Caleb said. He did. Tonight, in the corral. That old trapper wants to marry you. He said each word like he was turning over a strange coin to find the counterfeit. Why? And there it was, the question, the one she'd asked Gideon herself, and the answer Caleb gave himself before she could speak nearly broke something in her. Oh. Caleb's face cleared. He sat back. Oh, I see it now. A man alone up there. Course. He smiled, and it was worse than the laugh. He don't want a wife, Hattie. He wants a mule that cooks. He wants somebody to haul his loads and tend his stock and warm his bed. Somebody nobody'll come looking for, somebody so grateful she won't run off no matter how he treats her. That's all you are to a man like that. You understand he picked you 'cause you're desperate, and there's nobody to ask after you. He shook his head almost gentle now, the cruelest gentle in the world. And the sorry part is you're sitting there glad about it. Look at your face. You're glad. She was glad. She had been glad sitting on that bucket in the dark, and Caleb had just reached into her chest and crushed the gladness in his fist and handed it back to her, ruined the way he'd been ruining things for her since she was a girl. And the terrible thing, the thing that kept her up that whole long night in the loft, was that she could not be sure he was wrong. Gideon Hale had said it himself. It's a deal, a contract. He'd looked her in the eye and called her the best, and never once called her anything a woman wants to be called. Maybe that was honest. Or maybe Caleb had named the truth under the honest the way he always named the worst thing, and made it sound like the only thing. She didn't sleep. She lay in the straw above the stalls and listened to the horses breathe below her, the only company that had never once judged her, and she turned the silver dollar over and over until the edge of it wore a groove in her thumb. In the morning, she had a bruise on her arm where Caleb had grabbed her the day before, a yellow-green thumbprint, and she stood at the cracked piece of mirror nailed by the loft ladder and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at her own face, which she did not often do because the mirror had never once told her anything kind. Broad and plain and weathered, 28 and looked older. A face the town laughed at. "You're the best," she said to it out loud in the trapper's flat, plain voice. "And they were too blind to keep you." It sounded ridiculous. It sounded like a thing a fool tells herself. And underneath the ridiculous, very quietly, it sounded like the first true thing anyone had said about her in 11 years, because she could not for the life of her remember the last time a person had wanted her for the thing she was good at instead of in spite of the thing she was. She made up her mind on the second day, and it was a horse that made it up for her. A wagon team came in off the freight road at noon, lathered and trembling the offside wheeler with a bowed tendon, and the whole four of them ruined by a driver who'd run them too hard down the grade. Curtis Vane's team. Vane himself climbed down cussing about the delay, and he saw Hattie come out to take the horses, and he said it loud to the three men with him, the way he always made sure to say it loud. "Careful, boys, here comes the livery sow. Don't let her sit on the wagon, she'll bust an axle." And the men laughed, because Vane signed their wages, and the laughter rolled over Hattie the way it had rolled over her 10,000 times. But this time, she had a silver dollar in her pocket and a mountain man's voice in her ears, and this time she looked up from the trembling ruined horse, with its bowed tendon, the horse that this fool had broken through, pure stupid cruelty. And she looked Curtis Vane dead in his eye. "You ran them down the Dutchman's grade with the brake half set," she said. Her voice carried. It surprised her how it carried. "I can read it in their hocks. This wheeler's tendons bowed for good, he'll never pull right again, and it's not the horse that's the fool, Mr. Vane. It's the man behind him." The yard went silent. Curtis Vane's face went the color of brick. "What did you say to me?" "I said you ruined a good horse through ignorance," Hattie said, and her heart was slamming, but her hands were steady, steady as they were in the killer's pen. "And then you stood in my yard and called me a name to feel bigger about it. I've taken that off this town my whole life. I'm done taking it. You bring me ruined stock. I'll fix what I can and tell you the truth about the rest, and you can keep your dollar and your laughing both." For one long, ringing second, nobody breathed. Then one of Vane's own men, a young hand, snorted a laugh, and this time it wasn't at Hattie. It was at Vane. And Curtis Vane heard the difference the way she'd heard the difference in the stockyard, and his face went from brick to something murderous. "You'll regret that mouth," he said low. "Caleb hears how you talk to me. You'll be out on your ear." "Tell him," Hattie said. "Tell him today." She turned her back on Curtis Vane, turned her broad, mocked back on the most powerful man in Red Bluff, and led the trembling horse into the cool of the barn, and her knees didn't start shaking until she was out of sight. And when they did, she pressed her forehead against the horse's neck and breathed, and the horse, sensing her, went still and lent her its quiet. The way she'd lent quiet to 100 horses. And Hattie Mercer understood in that moment that she had already decided. She'd decided the second she opened her mouth at Curtis Vane. The deciding had just been her mouth getting there before the rest of her. She walked to the river crossing that evening with everything she owned in a flour sack, which was not much a change of clothes, and her father's old hoof knife, and a tin of bag balm and the silver dollar. Gideon Hale was shoeing one of the sorrels when she came over the rise. He had the hoof between his knees and the nails in his teeth, and he didn't look up. But she saw his shoulders change when he heard her, a kind of settling. And when he set the hoof down and straightened and saw the flour sack in her hand, he understood the whole thing without a word being said. "You sure?" he said. "Not happy, not surprised. Just making certain the way you'd test ice before you trust it your weight. My brother says you want a mule that cooks." She made herself say it. She had to say it, had to put the worst thing out in the open between them, where she could watch his face when he answered the way she'd watch a horse's eye to know its heart. "He says you picked me, 'cause I'm desperate and nobody'll come asking. He says a man like you'll work me to death and warm his bed with me, and I'll be too grateful to run. He says that's all I am to you." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud later that it didn't shake. Tell me he's wrong, Mr. Hale. Look at me, and tell me, because I have been lied to my whole life, and I have got good at knowing it, and if you're lying, I'll see it, and I'd rather sleep in a ditch than be one more man's joke." Gideon Hale put down his shoeing hammer. He took the nails out of his mouth. He walked over to her slow, the way a man walks who doesn't want to spook a frightened thing, and he stood in front of her, and he didn't touch her, and he looked her dead in the eye for a long, plain moment. "Your brother," he said, "is a small man who spent his whole life standing on your back to make himself look taller, and the day you walk away, he's gonna find out how short he really is." That's why he said it. Not 'cause it's true, 'cause he's scared it's true that he needs you, and you don't need him. He let that sit. "I won't warm a bed with you that you don't offer, and you won't never owe me that, not as part of any deal, not ever you understand me. You'll have your own place in that cabin, and your own door if you want one, and I'll build it myself. I picked you 'cause you're the best hand I ever saw, and 'cause I watched a whole town spit on you and not one of them was fit to carry your tack. That's the truth. You said you'd know a lie. Look at me and find one." She looked. She'd spent her whole life learning to read the thing under the thing, the fear under the meanness in a horse, the lie under the smile in a man. She looked at Gideon Hale until it would have been rude if either of them had cared about rude, and she found a hard man and a wounded man and a lonely man. She did not find a liar. "All right," Hattie said. Her voice broke on it just slightly, and she hated that, and he had the grace to pretend he didn't hear it. "All right then." They were married the next morning by a circuit preacher in the front room of his own house with the preacher's wife and a hired man for witnesses, because there was nobody in Red Bluff. Hattie wanted standing up for her, and Gideon knew nobody at all. It took 4 minutes. The preacher's wife kept sneaking looks at the bride, the big plain woman in her one clean dress, marrying the silent mountain man, and Hattie saw the woman trying to work out the arithmetic of it. The same arithmetic the whole town would be doing by noon, and for once in her life, Hattie did not care what sum they came to. Caleb found out before they were clear of town. He came running down the street bareheaded, and Hattie saw him coming, and her stomach dropped the old drop, the lifetime drop. "Hattie!" He pulled up short of Gideon, who had stepped without seeming to move at all, just slightly between them. "Hattie, what in hell? You married him. You actually—" He laughed, wild, disbelieving. "You can't just leave. Who's gonna run the livery? Who's gonna handle the stock? You can't. We got a deal? You and me, We never had a deal, Caleb," Hattie said. "A deal's between two people who both get something. I gave and you took. That's not a deal. That's just what I let you do because I didn't think I could do better." "Better." Caleb's face twisted. "You call that better? Running off to die on a mountain with some old Hattie. He'll have you in a grave by spring, you understand. Nobody's coming to look for you up there. Nobody. You'll be alone with a stranger, and nobody on God's earth will know if you live or die." His voice cracked, and for 1 second she almost believed it was love, before she remembered it was the livery. "Don't do this to me. Who's gonna do the work?" And there it was, the truth of it, naked at last. Who's gonna do the work? Not "don't go." Not "I'll miss you." Not "you're my sister." 11 years of taking the credit and the dollars and the roof over her head, and at the very end with his sister leaving forever. The only thing Caleb Mercer could grieve was the labor. Hattie looked at her brother for what she somehow knew would be the last time, and she found she didn't hate him. She'd thought she would in this moment. Instead, she felt the thing you feel for a horse that bites, because it was made to bite a sorrow without surprise. "You'll hire 2 men to do what I did," she said gently. "And you'll pay them 3 times what you paid me, which was nothing, and you'll still wonder why the stock don't settle for them. And maybe someday you'll understand that I was the best thing that ever happened to that livery, and you spent 20 years too busy stepping on me to see it." She picked up the lead rope of the sorrel that carried her flour sack. "Goodbye, Caleb. I hope you find your gratitude. I won't be around to need it anymore." Gideon Hale touched his hat brim to Caleb Mercer, which was more courtesy than the man deserved, and the two of them turned their stock toward the high blue line of the mountains, and they left Red Bluff behind, and Hattie did not look back. and Caleb stood in the middle of the street, getting smaller and smaller, until the rise of the road took him, and that was the end of the woman. Nobody wanted, though she did not know it yet. They rode 3 days into the high country. Gideon didn't talk much, which suited Hattie fine, because she'd done her whole life's worth of explaining herself, and she was tired of it. But she watched him the way she watched all living things, and she learned him on the trail, the way she'd learn a new horse. She learned he checked her cinch each morning without making a show of it in case the night had loosened it. She learned he gave her the better blanket and lied that he ran warm. She learned that when the trail narrowed along a drop that would kill you, he put himself on the outside without a word. And she learned on the second night the size of the wound he carried. She'd waked to find his bedroll empty and found him standing apart in the dark, just standing, looking up at the black shoulder of the mountain ahead. And she'd come up quiet beside him, the way she'd come up on the bucket that first night. "They're up there," she said. Not a question. She'd read it in him for 2 days. "Your wife and your girl." For a long time he didn't answer. The mountain man who never spoke an unnecessary word. "Sarah," he said finally. "And Beth." Beth was 6. His voice didn't change, but his hands did, closing slow at his sides. "I was 3 days out on my line. Storm came in fast, faster than any I'd seen. By the time I fought my way home, the cabin was buried to the roof, and the fire was 3 days cold, and they—" He stopped. Sarah had wrapped Beth up in everything we had, held her, tried to keep her warm with her own body till the last. I found them like that, holding on. He breathed out slow. "I've asked myself every day for 11 years why I lived and they didn't. Best I can figure there ain't no why. The mountain don't care who's good. It just takes who it can reach, and I wasn't there to be reached." Hattie stood beside him in the dark and did not say she was sorry, because she'd had a lifetime of people saying they were sorry and meaning thank God it's you and not me. Instead, she did the thing she did with a grieving animal. She just stood close, lending her quiet, asking nothing, until after a long while, she felt the rigid thing in him ease just slightly, the way the killer stallion had eased. "That's why you don't want a thing that can be taken," she said softly. "Reckon it is, Mr. Hale." She waited till he looked at her. "I'm not gonna get took. I don't spook in storms. I never have. It's the one thing this body's good for that the town never could find a use for. You won't come home to me cold. I'll be the one dragging you in out of it. You'll see." And Gideon Hale looked at the big plain woman the whole world had thrown away, standing easy in the killing dark that had murdered everything he loved, promising him she wouldn't die. And something moved across his hard face that hadn't moved in 11 years. And he turned away fast so she wouldn't see it. But she saw it. She read everything. That was her gift. They reached the cabin on the 3rd day, high up where the air went thin and the wind never fully stopped, a stout log place he'd built with his own hands and a barn beside it better built than the cabin. And Hattie understood the man entirely from those 2 buildings that he'd housed his stock better than himself. And she loved him a little for it before she'd let herself know it was love. He kept his word about the door. The first thing Gideon Hale did before he'd even unpacked the supplies was hang a curtain across the corner of the cabin where he'd built her a bunk, a private place her own, so that she'd know the deal was the deal and nothing under it. "There," he said, gruff, hammering the last peg. "Your place. Yours. Nobody comes past that curtain that you don't ask in." He stepped back, "Including me." Hattie looked at the curtain. It was a sorry thing, an old wool blanket on a length of cord. It was the first space in the whole world that had ever in 28 years belonged to Hattie Mercer alone. "Thank you," she said, and this time her voice did break all the way, and she did not try to stop it, and Gideon Hale had the grace to busy himself with the supplies and let her have the breaking in private behind her own curtain, in her own place on her own mountain, where no one had ever laughed at her and no one ever would. That night the wind rose, and somewhere below in the barn, the stock grew restless, and Hattie heard it through the cabin wall, the way she heard everything. A change in the rhythm of the animals that meant something was wrong. She was up and pulling on her boots before Gideon had stirred. "Trouble," came his voice from the dark. "Horses are saying something's out there." She had her father's hoof knife in her hand. "Cat, maybe. They sound like it's a cat." "It's likely just the wind." But he was up too, reaching for the rifle. "First night up here, you don't know the sounds yet." "I know fear," Hattie said. "I've been listening to it my whole life. That's a barn full of fear, and it's got a shape and 4 legs and it's circling." She was at the door. "Light the lantern and follow if you want. But don't you come busting in there loud. There's a panicked horse down there, and if you spook him worse, he'll go through the rails and break a leg on the rocks, and then you'll have to shoot a good horse, 'cause you wouldn't listen to me on my first night. I'm going slow and quiet. You come slow and quiet behind." And Gideon Hale, who had survived 11 years alone on that mountain by trusting nobody's judgment but his own, stood in his own cabin in the dark and watched the woman he'd married for a deal walk out into the wind toward a danger he couldn't yet hear, giving him orders in his own barnyard, like she'd lived there 20 years, and the strangest thing happened. He did exactly what she told him. He lit the lantern slow. He came slow and quiet behind. And he found her already inside the barn, already between the wild-eyed sorrel and the thing that had spooked it. Her broad back to the danger, and her hands open, and her voice going low and steady. The same voice from the killer's pen 100 miles and a whole lifetime ago, and out beyond the lantern light. Just past the rails, 2 yellow eyes hung in the dark and watched and gauged its chances against the big calm woman who stood between it and what it wanted. The cat gathered itself to spring. Hattie didn't turn. She couldn't turn, or the horse would bolt. She heard the gather in the silence. The particular silence of a thing about to leap. And she had 1 second to decide whether to save herself or the horse. And Gideon Hale, lantern in one hand, and rifle coming up in the other, saw his new wife make the decision in the set of her shoulders, saw her choose the horse, saw her plant her body as the shield. And he understood in that frozen instant that the town of Red Bluff had thrown away the bravest soul he had ever known in his life, and he had less than a heartbeat to raise the rifle before the yellow eyes left the ground. The rifle never fired. In the half-second before the cat left the ground, Hattie did the thing no trained man would have done. She didn't run, and she didn't freeze. She threw back her head and roared a sound that came up out of her broad chest from someplace older than fear. A sound that filled the whole barn and bounced off the rafters, the sound of a thing bigger and madder than the cat had counted on. And the cat, already gathered, already committed, flinched in the air. Its leap went wide. It hit the rail instead of the woman, scrabbled, and was gone over the side and into the dark, a streak of tawny terror running from a noise. For a second nobody moved. The horse trembled against Hattie's shoulder. Gideon stood in the doorway with the rifle half raised and the lantern shaking in his other hand, and his face was the color of ash. "You," his voice came out cracked, "you roared at a mountain lion. Worked, didn't it?" But her hands were on the horse now, both of them gentling, and he could see they trembled too. A cat picks the easy kill. Make yourself not easy most times, they go find a deer. She pressed her face into the sorrel's neck and breathed. Most times. And the times it don't, then I'd have had a bad night. She said it light, but he heard underneath it, and it turned his stomach over how cheap she held her own life, how practiced she was at standing between danger and something worth more than her. He'd seen it twice now. He understood he would see it again, and the understanding frightened him more than the cat had. "Don't do that again," Gideon said, and it came out rougher than he meant. "Don't you stand in front of a thing like that for a horse. Not on this mountain. Not for any horse I own." Hattie turned and looked at him over the sorrel's back, and there was something almost like wonder in her plain face. "You're worried about me." "I'm worried about losing a hand I just got." "No." She said it slow, reading him the way she read everything. "That's not it. You're worried about me." She shook her head, and her eyes were bright. "Mr. Nobody's worried about me in 20 years. I don't rightly know what to do with it." Gideon Hale stood holding a lantern in a cold barn at midnight, and could not find a single word, and so he did what he always did when words failed, which was turn away and find something to do with his hands. He latched the barn door. He'd never properly latched before the door that had let the cat in, and he said into the dark, not looking at her, "We'll fix this latch come morning. Both of us. Go on to bed. You did good. You did good? She lay awake a long time behind her wool curtain, turning those 3 words over the way she'd turned the silver dollar. Caleb had never said them once. The whole town of Red Bluff had never said them once. A man she'd known 4 days had said them like they cost nothing, and they were the richest thing she owned. That was the last easy night. The mountain had let them be those first weeks, the way a deep pool lets you wade out, smiling, before the bottom drops away. October turned, and the weather turned with it, and Hattie learned the truth of the high country, which was that it didn't kill you with one great blow. It killed you with patience, an inch at a time, testing every seam in you to find the one that gave. It tested her body first. The thin air at first had her gasping after 20 steps uphill. Her heart slamming, her strong legs gone watery, and she hated it. Hated that the one thing that had always served her strength, her size. The body, the town mocked. But that had never once failed her at hard work, was failing now at the simple act of breathing. She'd haul a load of split wood 10 feet and have to stop hands on her knees, chest heaving, and Gideon would watch from the corner of his eye and say nothing. And the not saying was its own kindness, because if he'd offered to take the load, she'd have died before she handed it over. It comes, he told her once, the only time he spoke of it. The air, your blood thickens up to it, takes a month or 2. You'll wake up one morning and not notice the climb. Everybody goes through it. Sarah did. He stopped the way he always stopped at the name. She got through it. So will you. You comparing me to your dead wife, Mr. Hale. She meant it light to give him an out. He didn't take the out. He looked at her steady. I'm telling you, the mountain takes the soft ones in the first month, and it's been a month and you're still here. That's not nothing. Sarah was tough as wang leather and proud of it. I don't hand out that comparison cheap. It undid her a little, that. She had to go split wood to have somewhere to put it. The work was the saving of her. She might not be able to breathe yet, but she could read an animal at 12,000 feet the same as at sea level. And within 2 weeks she'd turned his string of mules from a balky, half-wild bunch into a working remuda that came when she called and stood when she said stand. She found the bay mule's cracked hoof before it went lame, packed it, saved the season's haul. She rebuilt the picket line so the stock couldn't tangle in the night the way they'd been tangling for years. She watched Gideon set his traps, and within a week was setting them better because she understood the animals he was after. The way she understood the animals, he kept their fear and their hunger and the shape of their wanting. You ever trap before? He asked her. Watching her bed a set into a creek bank so cunningly he'd have walked over it himself. Never. But a marten wants what a horse wants, to not get caught. You just gotta think where you'd step if you was scared of getting caught, and then you set it one step before that. She tamped the dirt. Everything alive is mostly just trying not to get caught, Mr. Hale. Took me 28 years to learn it. You learn it, you can read anything. And Gideon Hale, kneeling beside her in the cold mud, looked at the woman a town had thrown away, and thought she has learned the whole world from the inside of being hunted. And the thought sat in him like a stone, and he could not stop turning it over, that the cruelty of Red Bluff had ground her down into the wisest soul he'd ever knelt beside, and that he was the only living man who had ever bothered to look. They fell into a rhythm, the two of them, and it was the strangest thing that had ever happened to either of them, the strangeness of being easy with another person. Hattie had never in her life been easy with anyone. She'd spent every waking hour braced for the next cruelty, reading every face for the laugh forming behind it. And up here, there was no face but Gideon's, and Gideon's face never once formed the laugh. He was hard and quiet, and sometimes a whole day went by with not 10 words between them, but the 10 words were never cruel, and a body can heal a great deal in the simple absence of cruelty, more than it can heal under kindness even. She started to talk. She who'd learned silence as armor started to fill the cabin in the evenings with talk because for the first time she had a listener who didn't use her words against her. She told him about her father, the only person who'd ever seen her gift, who'd put her on a horse before she could walk, and told her she had hands like nobody he'd ever seen. She told him how he'd died when she was 12, and how the gift had become a curse the same day, because a girl who could outhandle any man was a freak, a thing to be uneasy about, and the same town that would have called a boy with her hands a prodigy called her an abomination. "They was scared of you," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "Scared of me." She laughed. "Look at me. What's to be scared of?" "That's exactly it. You can do a thing no man among them can do, and you do it in a body they decided to despise, and that means their despising is a lie, and folks will do most anything before they'll admit their meanness was built on a lie. Easier to laugh at you than look at the laugh and see what's under it." He fed a stick to the fire. "They didn't throw you out 'cause you were less than them, Hattie. They threw you out 'cause every time you gentled a horse they couldn't touch you proved you were more, and they couldn't stand the proof." The fire popped. Hattie sat very still. "Nobody," she said finally, and her voice was not steady, "ever said that to me in my whole life. Nobody ever once said it like that." Reckon they were too busy laughing to think it through. Gideon stood stiff from the cold and banked the fire for the night. "I had a lot of years up here with nothing to do but think things through. Turns out I'm better at it than talking." He paused at the curtain that hung across her corner. "Night, Hattie." "Night, Gideon." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He stopped just for a second, his back to her, and then he went on to his own bunk and said nothing. But she'd seen the stop, and she lay behind her curtain and held it close. That small stop, that proof that her using his name had landed somewhere in him. The snows came in earnest in November, and the mountains stopped testing and started hunting in earnest. The first real storm pinned them in the cabin 3 days, and it was in those 3 days that the deal between them quietly stopped being a deal and became something neither of them had words for and neither would have dared to name. They played cards by firelight. He taught her a trapper's game, and she beat him at it within an hour by reading his face, and he laughed. Actually laughed. A rusty broken sound, like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. And it shocked them both into silence. And then she laughed too, and the cabin that had held one grieving man for 11 years held the sound of 2 people laughing for the first time, and the walls seemed to lean in to listen. On the second night of that storm, she woke to the sound of him in the grip of a dream. She'd heard it before, the same words, "Sarah Beth, hold on. I'm coming. Hold on." And every other night, she'd lain still and let him have his grief private, the way he let her have hers. But this night, the dream had teeth, and he was thrashing, and she heard in his voice the particular pitch of a man drowning, and she did the thing she'd never have dared in daylight. She crossed the cabin and put her hand on his shoulder. "Gideon, Gideon, wake up. You're here. You're up the mountain and the fire's lit, and you're here." He came awake with a violence that would have frightened a smaller soul, came up swinging, and her strong hand caught his wrist easy and held it, not fighting him, just holding, the way she held a panicked horse weight and calm and no fear, until the wildness went out of him, and he understood where he was and who had hold of his arm. "Hattie." His chest heaved. Forgive me. I don't—" "You were dreaming of them." Every storm. It came out of him broken in the dark, the thing he'd never told a living soul. 11 years. Every storm, I'm 3 days out again, fighting home, knowing what I'm going to find, and I can't get there no faster than I got there then. Every single storm, Hattie. I dig them out again. 11 years and I never once got there in time, not even in the dream. And Hattie Mercer, who had never in her life been the one to comfort, who had only ever been the one in need of it and gone without, sat down on the edge of a grieving man's bunk in the howling dark and did not let go of his wrist. "You got there this time," she said. "You hear that wind? That's a real storm right now tonight. And you're not 3 days out. You're here. And there's somebody in this cabin, and she's not buried, and she's not cold. She's right here holding your arm, and the storm can howl all it wants, 'cause it didn't get her. It didn't get her, Gideon. For once in 11 years the storm came and it didn't take a single thing from you. You're here in time. You finally got here in time." He made a sound she'd never heard a man make. And then Gideon Hale, the hardest man in the territory, the man who'd buried his whole heart in frozen ground. 11 winters back, put his face in his free hand and wept. The deep, tearing weeping of grief that's been frozen too long and finally thaws. And Hattie held his wrist through all of it, and asked nothing, and said nothing, and just lent him her quiet, her bottomless quiet, until the storm outside, and the storm inside him, both at last, began to ease toward morning. He didn't speak of it after. Neither did she. But something had broken open in that cabin that couldn't be closed again, and they both knew it, and they were both, for different reasons, afraid of it. Because Hattie had begun to want. That was the danger she'd guarded against her whole life, the one stick she'd never hand anybody the wanting. To want was to hope, and to hope was to give the world a place to wound you. She'd survived 28 years by wanting nothing she couldn't get with her own two hands. And now she lay behind her curtain at night, listening to a man breathe across a cold cabin, and she wanted God help her. She wanted to cross that floor, and not for any deal, and the wanting terrified her, worse than the cat, worse than the thin air, worse than anything the mountain had thrown, because she knew how it ended. She'd been the joke too many times. Even up here, even after everything, the old voice was always there, Caleb's voice, the town's voice. A mule that cooks. He picked you 'cause you're desperate. He'll warm his bed with you, and you'll be too grateful to run. And the worst part, the part that kept her rigid behind her curtain, was that if she let herself want him and she was wrong, if she crossed that floor and found out it really had been just a deal all along, it would kill something in her that the whole town of Red Bluff in 28 years of trying had never managed to kill. So she said nothing. And he, carrying his own load of fear, his terror of loving another thing the mountain could take, said nothing either. And the two of them circled the truth all through December, like two horses circling water they were too spooked to drink. Then came the morning that changed it. A Chinook blew through a false thaw warm wind off the western slope, and the snow went soft and rotten, and Gideon read the sky and didn't like it. "This weather's a liar," he said, pulling on his coat. "Warm now, but there's a blue norther stacked up behind it. I can feel it in my teeth. I got traps out on the north line that'll be froze solid under ice if I don't pull 'em today, lose the whole line. I'll be back by dark. I'll come." "No." He said it flat. "Somebody minds the stock, and the north line's bad country ice over rock, no place for—" He stopped himself, but she heard the rest of it. "No place for me," she finished. "On account of my size. On account of it's a bad slope and the footing won't hold under a heavy step, and that's not an insult, that's just the rock." He met her eye. "It'd be no place for me neither if I weighed what you weigh. It's nothing to do with the town's nonsense. It's physics. You've seen ice over rock. You know." She did know. He was right, and she knew he was right, and that was somehow worse, that her body, which had finally found its place up here, was the one thing that had to stay behind. "Then you be careful," she said. "You hear me, Gideon Hale? That blue norther you feel in your teeth, you don't outrun it for any string of traps. Martin ain't worth a man. You turn back if it turns on you. Promise me." "I've been on this mountain 11 years. That's not a promise. That's an excuse a dead man makes." She crossed to him, and she did something she'd never done. She put her strong hand flat on his chest over his heart and felt it beating under her palm. "Promise me you'll come back through that door tonight. I have had exactly one place in this whole world that was mine, and one person who ever once said I did good, and they're the same mountain and the same man, and if the norther takes you, I lose both in one day. So you promise me, right now." Gideon Hale looked down at the woman's hand on his chest, and then up at her plain, fierce face, and for one suspended moment in the doorway of the cabin, it seemed the truth they'd both been circling might finally get said out loud. "I promise," he said instead. "Just that." And he put his own scarred hand over hers, pressed it once against his heart, and then he was out the door into the false warm wind. And Hattie stood in the doorway and watched him go up the slope and over the rise, until the mountain took him from her sight. The thaw held till noon. Then the wind swung around to the north, hard all at once, the way he'd said it would, and the temperature fell off a cliff 40 degrees in an hour. The warm, rotten snow going to iron, and then the sky to the north went the color of a fresh bruise, and the first snow came not falling, but flying sideways, and Hattie Mercer stood in the cabin door with her heart climbing into her throat and watched the blue norther come down off the high peaks like the wrath of God, and Gideon was not back. She got the stock in. She did it fast and right, even as the fear clawed at her because the stock came first. It always came first, and a panicked hand was no use to anybody. She got every animal into the barn and forked them hay and barred the door he'd fixed, and then she stood in the dooryard with the wind trying to take her off her feet, and she screamed his name into the storm, and the storm ate it whole and gave back nothing. The light started to go. Not sunset, the storm eating the day, and still no Gideon coming over that rise. And Hattie Mercer understood, standing in the killing wind, that she was about to do the thing she had promised him she wouldn't have to do for him, and the thing she had sworn the mountain would never make her watch. She was about to lose her one place and her one person both, unless she went out into the thing that had murdered his whole family and dragged him back from it herself. She thought of his dream. 3 days out fighting home knowing what I'm gonna find. She thought of Sarah, who'd wrapped her child in everything she had and held her against the cold till the last and lost. And she thought, not this time. This time, somebody gets there in time. This time, the storm doesn't get to win. She went back inside, not to hide, but to arm herself against the cold, the way a soldier arms for war. Every garment they owned. The lantern, the rope, the flask of whiskey for the wound. She somehow already knew in her bones she'd find. Because the dream had told her. Because the mountain only made a man promise to come home on the day it meant to break that promise for him. She tied the rope to the doorpost and paid it out behind her so the storm couldn't steal her way back. And Hattie Mercer, the woman nobody wanted, the heifer, the joke, the burden, put her shoulder to the door of the only home she'd ever had and shoved it open against the screaming dark and walked out into the blue norther to find her husband, and the storm closed behind her like a fist. The rope was her lifeline and her tether both, and Hattie paid it out hand over hand as she fought up the slope, leaning into the wind at an angle that would have toppled a lighter soul. That was the first time in her whole life her size became a gift instead of a curse. A small woman would have been swept off the mountain in the first 100 yards. Hattie Mercer was 300 pounds of bone and muscle and stubbornness, and the wind could not take her, and she understood with a kind of savage joy, even in the middle of her terror, that the very body the town had thrown her away for was the only body on God's earth that could have made this climb and lived. Gideon. The storm swallowed his name. She'd reckoned it would. She wasn't calling for him to hear. She was calling so that if he was conscious somewhere out in this white nothing, he'd know somebody was coming. She'd learned that from horses, too. A lost, frightened thing didn't need to understand your words. It just needed to know it wasn't alone in the dark. The rope ran out. She'd known it would. 40 feet of rope, and the north line a mile off, and she stood at the end of her tether with the cabin lost behind her in the white, and the whole murdering mountain ahead. And she had a choice to make, the same choice she'd made in the killer's pen, and the same choice she'd made in the barn with the cat. Save herself, or save the thing worth more than herself. She let go of the rope. She let go of the one thing connecting her to warmth and safety, and the only home she'd ever owned, and she struck out into the trackless storm with nothing but the slope under her feet to tell her up from down, because Gideon Hale had let go of his own safety to give her a place in this world, and she would be damned. She would be damned if she'd hold tighter to a rope than he'd held to her. She found his trapline by the stakes. He'd marked his sets with peeled willow wands, and she'd helped him cut them. And now, in the screaming white, she found one, then another, then a third, following them up the north slope, the way a child follows crumbs, and she blessed every cold hour she'd spent learning his line, because it was the only map left in the world. The fourth stake was snapped off. She stopped. A snapped stake meant something had gone wrong here, something with weight behind it, and she got down on her hands and knees in the snow below the worst of the wind, and she read the ground, the way she read everything, and there, half buried already, she found the long gouge where a man had slid, and at the end of it, the pale shape of a deadfall pine that the rotten thaw snow had let go a whole tree come down across the slope, and under it, a boot. Gideon. She reached him and clawed the snow from his face, and he was alive, gray half frozen, his eyes barely tracking but alive, and when he saw her face above him, something moved in his ruined expression that was not relief and not joy, but a kind of holy disbelief, as if a dead man had found God's own mercy leaning over him in the storm. "You came," he said. His lips barely worked. "I told you Northline no place for—" "You shut your mouth, Gideon Hale." She was already at the tree reading it, finding the leverage. "You can lecture me on what's no place for me when we're both warm. The tree's got your leg. Leg's broke." He said it flat, the trapper assessing the trap. "Snapped when she came down. I've been trying to dig out 2 hours. Can't get purchase. Hattie." His hand found her sleeve gripped weak. "The blood. Bone come through. I'm bleeding into the snow. You see it, black snow. That's not good. You know that's not good." She saw it. The dark stains spreading under him, freezing as it spread, the kind of bleeding that emptied a man slow and certain. And Hattie Mercer, kneeling in the storm that had killed his wife and his child, looked at the man dying under the tree and did not let 1 ounce of her terror show on her face, because a panicked hand was no use to anybody, and a panicked rescuer was worse. "All right," she said, calm as still water. "First the tree, then the bleeding, then home. One thing at a time. You ready?" "You can't lift that. 300-pound of green pine. Watch me." She found a fallen limb and jammed it under the trunk and braced her back against a boulder and put her legs into it. All that mocked weight, all that despised strength. Every pound the town of Red Bluff had laughed at, and she drove upward with a sound that tore out of her throat and was half scream and half prayer. And the great tree groaned and lifted an inch, 2 inches. "Pull," she roared. "Pull your leg. Gideon, now." And he dragged himself, screaming, the broken leg coming free with the bone grinding, and she held the tree up with her whole burning body until he was clear. And then she let it drop, and it hit the slope with a thud she felt in her teeth, and Gideon Hale lay free on the snow, and Hattie collapsed beside him, with her lungs on fire, and her vision going to sparks. And for 1 second, the two of them just lay there in the murdering white breathing. "You lifted it," he whispered. "Hattie, you lifted a tree off me." "Don't sound so surprised." She was already up on her knees, already pulling off her own coat. "I've been lifting things my whole life, just never had a reason worth lifting for till now." She wadded the coat against the wound hard, the way her father had taught her, with a horse cut to the bone. "This is gonna hurt, and I'm sorry, and I'm doing it anyway. The bleeding stops first, or none of the rest matters." He passed out when she cinched it tight. That was a mercy, and she took it. And then came the part that no man in Red Bluff, no man in the whole territory would have believed a woman could do. She got Gideon Hale up onto her back. She'd done it with downed horses, the deadlift hoist that nobody taught a woman because nobody believed a woman could need it, and she did it now with 180 pounds of unconscious man and a broken leg, got him across her broad shoulders in a carry, and stood up under him by main strength, swaying, finding her feet, and she turned downhill into the storm with the only map she had left. Gravity and the memory of stakes and the bull-headed refusal to let the mountain win twice. She lost the trail. She found it. She lost it again. The cold got into her without her coat, and she stopped feeling her hands, and then her arms, and the only warmth in the whole white world was the failing heat of the man on her back. And she fixed her mind on that, and walked 1 foot and then the other, talking the whole way, talking to him the way she talked to a horse that wanted to lie down and die in the snow. "Don't you quit on me. You hear? You made me a promise. You'd come through that door tonight, and you're a man, pays his debts. You said so yourself. You handed me a silver dollar and called yourself a man pays his debts. So you're gonna pay this one. You're gonna come through that door if I have to carry you through it myself, which I am. I am carrying you through it. So stay with me, Gideon. You stay with me." She found the rope by falling over it. She'd let it go a mile and an hour and a lifetime ago, and her frozen body fell across it in the dark, and her numb hands knew the feel of it, even when they couldn't feel anything else. And she wept, then finally hauling herself and the man on her back along that rope. Hand over frozen hand toward the cabin, she could not yet see weeping, with a relief so total it nearly finished what the cold had started. She got him through the door. She kept the promise he'd made. She got Gideon Hale through the door of the only home she'd ever owned, and she kicked it shut against the storm, and she laid him down by the dead fire, and then Hattie Mercer, who had not stopped moving in 4 hours, finally let herself look at what she had to do next, and her heart quailed. Because the cold and the carry had only been the beginning. Now came the leg. She built the fire up first with hands that wouldn't work, fumbling the tinder a dozen times before it caught. She got him out of his frozen clothes and into every blanket they owned. And then she made herself look at the wound, the bone come through the skin, the leg bent where no leg should bend. And she knew with sick certainty that if she didn't set it now tonight, before the swelling made it impossible, he'd lose the leg if he didn't lose his life. And there was no doctor within 60 frozen miles, and no one coming, and no one who'd ever come, because that was the deal of the mountain, that was the deal of her whole life. There was never anyone coming. There was only Hattie. "Just you and me, big man," she said the words she'd said to the killer stallion a lifetime ago in another world. "Just you and me, and I got all night." He woke when she pulled the boot. She'd hoped he'd stay under, and he didn't, and he came up off the floor with a scream that the storm outside answered, and his hand shot out and found her wrist and gripped. "Hattie, God, what are you?" "I'm setting your leg." She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The bone's got to go back true, or it sets crooked, and you're a cripple, or it sets foul, and you're a corpse. I've set 100 horse legs, and the bone's the same bone, and the pull's the same pull, and I am going to set yours. And I need you to bite down on this, and hate me for a minute, because the minute's gonna be bad. You can't a horse you just if it goes wrong, you shoot a horse. I'm not shooting you. She put the leather strap between his teeth. I'm fixing you. There's a difference you taught me that you're self-mean and scared broke and whole. You're not broke past fixing Gideon Hale. You hear me? You are not broke past fixing. Now bite down. She set the bone. She put her whole despised body into the pull traction, the way her father showed her, slow and even and merciless, until the bone slid back under the skin and seated true, with a sound she felt more than heard. And Gideon Hale screamed into the leather, and then went mercifully dark again. And Hattie held the pull a long moment, to be sure, weeping openly now, with no one to see. And then she splinted it with the lengths of wood. She'd had the foresight to bound it tight, and sat back on her heels, with the man's blood to her elbows, and the storm howling at the door, and understood that she had just done a thing that not one soul in Red Bluff would have believed her capable of. The heifer. The joke, the burden, and there was no one to see it. And it didn't matter that there was no one to see it, because she hadn't done it for anyone to see. She'd done it because she loved him. There it was plain at last, the truth she'd circled since the first storm. She loved him, and love wasn't the wanting she'd been so afraid of. Love was this. Love was a tree lifted and a mile walked, and a bone set in the dark with nobody watching. Love was being the one who came. She cleaned the wound with the whiskey, poured it into the torn flesh, while he moaned half-conscious, and she stitched it with the needle and thread. She'd brought neat small stitches like her mother had taught her before the fever. The only thing her mother ever taught her, and she thought, "Look, Ma, it wasn't useless after all," and she bound it clean. And then the cold came for him in earnest. She'd stopped the blood and set the bone and closed the wound, and she thought the worst was past. And the mountain laughed at her because near dawn his shivering stopped. Just stopped. And his skin went from cold to a terrible waxy cool, and his breathing turned shallow and far between, and Hattie Mercer, who knew the signs of a freezing animal better than any doctor knew the signs. In a man understood that he was dying anyway, that the cold had gotten so deep into him during the hours under the tree that his own body had given up trying to make heat, and that he was slipping away from her, not through the wound, but through the simple final surrender of a body too cold to live. No. She said it to the cabin, to the storm, to God. No, not after all that. You don't get to take him after all that. She had no medicine for this. There was no bone to set, no wound to close. There was only one source of heat in the whole frozen world, and it was the very thing the town of Red Bluff had mocked her whole life long, the broad, heavy, despised abundance of her own body, and Hattie Mercer did not hesitate for even one heartbeat. She stripped the blankets back, and she lay down against him, and she wrapped that body around him, the body they'd laughed at, the body that was too much, and she gave him every degree of warmth she had pressed full against him. Chest to chest, her arms around him and her legs around his good leg, and her broad back curved over him like a wall against the killing cold. Exactly, she realized. Exactly as Sarah had once wrapped herself around little Beth and given everything she had against the cold, and where Sarah had lost where the storm had won 11 years ago, Hattie Mercer set herself to win. "Come on," she whispered against his ice-cold ear, holding him, pouring herself into him. "Come on, Gideon, take it. I got more than enough, you know that the whole town said so too much. That's what they always said, too much woman. Well, there's a use for it now. There's finally a use, so you take it. You take every bit of warm I got. I'm not Sarah. This isn't that storm. You get to win one. After 11 years, you finally get to win one. Take the heat and come back to me." The night was endless. She talked the whole way through it because she'd learned a lost thing in the cold needs to know it isn't alone, and she didn't know if he could hear her, and she talked anyway. Told him about the silver dollar she still had. Told him she'd known he wasn't lying that day at the river, because she could read a man the way she read a horse, and he'd had no lie in him. Told him she'd loved him since the night he hung a curtain, so a woman nobody wanted could have one place in the world that was hers. She told him things she'd never have dared say to his open eyes, and maybe that was the only way she could say them into the ear of a man too far gone to use them against her. Except she knew. She knew in her bones that Gideon Hale would never have used them against her, that he was the one man in the whole world who never would. And somewhere in the blackest hour, the hour when she'd nearly given up when his breathing had gone so shallow, she'd put her ear to his chest and barely found the beat. Somewhere in that hour, he stopped getting colder. She felt it before she believed it. A change. The smallest change. The same kind of change she'd feel in a foundering horse when it decided down in some animal place, past thought to live. His skin under her arms went from waxy cool to merely cold. A shiver ran through him. A real shiver, his body remembering how to fight, taking up the warmth she gave it and making its own at last. His breath deepened. Just a little. Just enough. "That's it." She was crying again and didn't care. "That's it, big man. There you are. There's the smart one. I knew you were in there. Come on back. Come on back to me. You promised me you'd come through that door, and you did come through it. Now you come back the rest of the way." Near dawn, the storm broke. The wind died all at once, the way mountain storms do, and a terrible clean silence came down over the cabin, and into that silence came the most beautiful sound Hattie Mercer had ever heard in her life. Gideon Hale, breathing slow and deep, and even asleep instead of dying. His body warm against hers. Alive, alive, kept alive through the longest night by the very thing the world had thrown her away for. She didn't move. She held him through the dawn, afraid to let go. Afraid the cold would come back if she did, and as the gray light came up through the one window, she felt him stir, felt him surface, felt the moment he came awake and understood where he was and who was wrapped around him, holding him back from death. He went very still. "Hattie," he said. His voice was a ruin, but it was his voice. "Hattie, what did you do?" "Kept you warm." She didn't let go. She'd thought she'd be ashamed this moment. The deal laid bare, the woman nobody wanted wrapped around a man who'd only ever offered her a contract. She found she wasn't ashamed at all. You were freezing to death. The blood was stopped and the bone was set, and you were dying anyway just from cold, and there wasn't anything left to do it with but me. So I did it with me. She felt him take that in. Felt the trapper's mind assemble it, the tree, the mile, the bone, the long night. You carried me. It wasn't a question. Off the north line, down through a blue norther, with my leg broke. On my back. That's a mile of ice over rock. His voice shook. That's the slope I told you no man could climb at your weight. Turned out, Hattie said, you were wrong about my weight. And Gideon Hale, the hardest man in the territory, the man who'd come down off the mountain 11 years ago, with his heart in 2 frozen graves, lay wrapped in the arms of the woman. A whole town had thrown away. The woman who had walked into the storm that killed his family and walked back out of it, carrying him. And he began, for the second time in his life, and the second time in front of her, to weep. But these were different tears. And she knew the difference because she knew everything. She read everything. And these were not the tears of grief. These were the tears of a man who had spent 11 years certain that anything he loved would be taken by the mountain, lying safe and warm in the arms of the one thing the mountain had reached for and failed to take. "You came," he said again, like he had under the tree, like he couldn't stop saying it. "Everybody else in my whole life the mountain took, or the world took, or I drove off so it couldn't take 'em. And you walked into the worst the mountains got, and you came and got me." His scarred hand found hers where it lay over his heart, and gripped it, and held on like a man holds on to the last solid thing. "Why? Why'd you do it? You could have stayed warm. The deal spring you could have just—" "There wasn't ever any deal, Gideon." She said it into his ear, soft and certain. "Not for me. There hasn't been a deal since the first storm, and you know it same as I know it. I didn't come for you 'cause of any contract." She tightened her arms around him, all that warmth, all that too much that had finally found the one thing in the world it was made for. "I came 'cause I love you, plain as that. I love you, and I wasn't going to stand in that cabin and let the mountain take you the way it took them, not while I had breath and a strong back and one place in this world worth fighting for. And you're it. You in this cabin. You're the only home I ever had." For a long moment, Gideon Hale didn't speak. The morning light grew. Down in the barn, a horse nickered, and the stock she'd saved called for their hay, and the ordinary world went on indifferent and alive. And then the man who never said 3 words together when one would do. The man who'd buried his whole heart in the frozen ground drew a long breath and turned his face toward hers. And there were no tears in his voice now, only something steadier and deeper, and more permanent than she'd dared hope for in all her 28 years of being the woman nobody wanted. "Then it ain't a deal no more," he said. "And it ain't gonna be. I got something to say to you, Hattie Mercer, and I'm gonna say it right soon as I can stand." And the broken leg shifted and he hissed through his teeth, "Which ain't gonna be today. But you stay right here. You stay right here and keep me warm, and don't you go nowhere, 'cause when I can stand, I got a thing to say to you that's got nothing to do with stock or winters or contracts, and I aim to say it on my feet like a man, even if it's spring, before I'm on 'em." And Hattie Mercer, holding the living warm weight of the only man who'd ever wanted her, in the only home she'd ever owned on the mountain that had tried to take him and failed, pressed her face into his neck, and let herself at long last, after a whole lifetime of guarding against the wanting hope. He didn't get to say it that spring. The mountain made sure of that. The leg healed slow, and it healed wrong the first month, despite everything Hattie did, because a bone set in a freezing cabin by lantern light doesn't always knit the way it ought. And there came a morning in February when Gideon woke with the leg swollen hot and red, and a fever climbing in him, and Hattie put the back of her hand to his brow, and felt the heat coming off him, and her stomach dropped clean through the floor. "It's gone bad," she said. She didn't lie to him. She'd never lied to him. "The wound's clean, but the bone's fighting something deep. There's poison in it. Then it comes off." Gideon said it flat, the trapper assessing the trap the way he'd said legs broke under the tree. "You've taken a leg off a horse gone bad. You can take mine. Better one-legged and breathing than—" "Don't you tell me to cut your leg off, Gideon Hale." Her voice shook, and then it steadied, because a panicked hand was no use to anybody, and she would not be panicked, not with his life on the scale. "Not yet. I got one thing to try first." What she tried was a thing her father had shown her, a poultice of things that grew even under snow, if a body knew where to dig, and she dug them by lantern light at the edge of the tree line with a cat. Maybe watching from the dark, and she did not care, and she packed the leg hot and drew the poison. The way you draw poison from a hoof, and she sat up 3 nights running with her hand on his chest, counting his breath. And on the 4th morning the fever broke, and the red went down, and the leg they'd both near given up for lost, began at last to truly heal. "You saved it twice," he told her, weak against the pillow. The leg. You saved it twice. First the tree and then the rot. I'm getting practice at saving you, she said. Reckon I'll get good at it you keep on like this? Reckon you already are. And he caught her hand, and for a moment it seemed he might say the thing, then fevered and grateful and undone, but she put her finger to his lips. Not like this, she said. You told me you'd say it on your feet like a man. I held you to a promise once, and it kept you alive. I'm holding you to this one. You say it on your feet, or you don't say it at all, and I'll wait. I waited 28 years for somebody to want me. I can wait for you to walk. So he healed, and she waited. And the mountain, which had spent the whole winter trying to take one of them from the other, gave up at last and let the spring come. It came the way it always came up high all at once after holding back too long. The ice went off the creek with a crack like a rifle, and the high meadows came green almost overnight, and the stock she'd saved that storming night grew sleek and easy on the new grass, and Gideon Hale began to walk. He walked badly at first, on a crutch. She'd carved him the leg stiff and the limp permanent, a limp. He'd carry the rest of his days as the mountain's signature on him. But he walked, and every day he walked a little farther out to the barn and back down to the creek, and back, and Hattie watched him from the corner of her eye, the way he'd once watched her struggle for breath, saying nothing, offering no arm, because she understood a proud thing needed to do, its own walking, or the walking meant nothing. And then came the morning he walked without the crutch. She was in the corral working a young horse when she saw him come out of the cabin and stand a moment in the door, and then set the crutch against the wall, deliberate, and step away from it. He crossed the dooryard to her on his own 2 feet. Slow, limping his jaw, set against the pain of it. And he came to the corral rail and put his hands on it and looked at her over it. And Hattie's heart began to climb into her throat, because she knew. She read everything. She read this. You're walking, she said. I'm walking. He came around the rail and into the corral, into the pen, the way she'd come into the killer's pen a year ago and a lifetime ago. And the young horse she'd been working sidled, and she steadied it with one hand, without taking her eyes off the man. Hattie. I've been on my feet a week now, and I've been putting this off, not 'cause I didn't want to say it, but 'cause I've been trying to find words big enough, and I'm a man's got about 4 words to his name on a good day, and none of 'em are big enough. So I'm just gonna say it plain, and you'll have to read the rest the way you read everything. He stopped in front of her. He took off his hat, took it clean off his head, and held it in both hands the way old Hardesty had taken his off in the stockyard, the day she gentled the black stallion, the way a man does in church. That first day in your brother's livery, Gideon said, I told you I needed a hand I couldn't lose, a wife on paper so the town couldn't reach you and the deal couldn't be broke. I told you it wasn't love, and I told you it wasn't romance, and I told you I was too old and too broke inside for either one. His voice was steady, but his hands were not turning the hat. I lied to you, Hattie, not on purpose. I lied to myself first, and then I handed it to you. The truth is, I'd stood in the shade of that mercantile for 2 hours, watching you gentle a horse no man could touch, and I'd heard a whole town spit on the finest soul I ever laid eyes on. And something in me that had been froze 11 years cracked clean open, and I didn't have the courage to call it what it was. So I called it a deal. 'Cause a deal can't be took from you and break your heart twice. I thought if I never let it be love, the mountain couldn't use it to finish me. The young horse stood quiet now, gentled by the stillness of them both. And then you walked into the storm that took Sarah and Beth. He went on, and his voice broke on the names, but he pushed through it. And you lifted a tree off me with your 2 hands, and you carried me a mile down a slope. I swore no soul your size could climb, and you set my leg in the dark, and you stitched me up. And when the cold come, to take me anyhow, you wrapped your own self around me and gave me the warmth out of your own body, the same warmth Sarah gave her child, and lost except you didn't lose. You won. You stood in the door of that storm, and you told the mountain, not this one, and the mountain backed down. 11 years it took everything I loved, and the night it come for the woman I'd married pretending it wasn't love, she beat it. She beat it, Hattie. with her bare hands and her broad back and her too much heart that the whole fool world threw away. He got down then. On his bad leg with the limp that would never leave him, Gideon Hale lowered himself down onto one knee in the corral dirt, and Hattie Mercer made a sound she'd never made in her life. "I'm not asking you to be my hand," he said, looking up at her. "I'm not asking you for a deal. We had a deal, and it died in a blue norther, and I'm glad it's dead. I'm asking you to be my wife, my real wife. Not on paper, not for the town, not for the stock. For me. Because I love you, Hattie Mercer, and I have loved you since the first time I watched you lay down your fear in front of a thing that could kill you. And I am done pretending it's anything else. Marry me. Stay. Not 'cause you got nowhere else, 'cause I checked. I made sure you'd have somewhere else. I'd have given you stock and supplies and sent you off to any town you named. You were never trapped here, not one day. Stay 'cause you want to. Stay 'cause you want me the way I want you. That's all I'm asking. That's the whole of it. Stay." And here was the twist that no soul in Red Bluff would have ever believed, that the man on his knee in the dirt, the hardest man in the territory, was begging the woman they'd all thrown away, begging her to want him, because in the end, he was the one who'd been alone 11 years. He was the one the mountain had hollowed out, and she was the one with warmth enough to fill a frozen man clean back to life. The town had it exactly backward. They always had. They'd looked at Hattie Mercer and seen a burden, a thing in need, a charity case. And the truth was, she was the richest soul on that whole mountain, rich in the only currency that mattered up high where men died of cold. And Gideon Hale had come down off his peak that day in Red Bluff, a beggar, and never known it till she'd filled his empty hands. Hattie looked down at him a long moment. She thought of her father who'd seen her gift and died before he could see it matter. She thought of her mother who'd taught her to stitch and never knew the stitches would one day close a dying man's wound. She thought of Caleb hollering her name into the night like she was a dog run off, and the whole town of Red Bluff laughing too big, too plain, too much, unwanted, unmarriageable a burden. She thought of every cruelty stacked up across 28 years, the whole crushing weight of a lifetime of being thrown away. And then she let it go. All of it. She felt it lift off her the way the tree had lifted off him, and she let it drop behind her in the dirt, and she would never pick it up again. "Get up," she said softly. "Hattie, get up off that knee, you stubborn fool man. You'll wreck the leg I saved twice." But she was reaching down for him as she said it, both her strong hands out, and she took his hands and she lifted him. Of course she lifted him. She'd been lifting things her whole life. She'd just never had a reason worth lifting for. Till him, and she brought him up onto his feet and held him there, steady, the way she steadied everything, and she put her broad hand flat against his chest, over the heart she'd kept beating through the longest night. "You want to know what to read, Gideon Hale?" Her eyes were streaming, and her voice was iron. "Read this. I have been called unwanted my whole life. Unwanted, unmarriageable a burden. I heard it so many times I built a wall in me and packed it tight as a stable wall against the cold. And I told myself I'd never want a single thing the world could take, 'cause wanting was just handing folks a stick to beat me with." She pressed her hand harder over his heart. "And then a quiet man hung a curtain in a cabin so a woman nobody wanted could have one place on earth that was hers. And he gave me the better blanket and lied that he ran warm. And he put himself on the outside of every drop on every trail. And he called me the best he ever saw, and he meant it, and he never once, not one single time in a whole hard winter, made me into a joke." Her voice cracked wide open. "You want my answer?" "Yes. Yes. I'll be your wife, your real wife, for you, and nothing else, till they put me in the ground." "Yes. 1,000 times yes. I'm not leaving this mountain, Gideon. I'm not leaving you. I'm home. For the first time in 28 years, I am finally home, and a team of mules couldn't drag me off it." He kissed her, then the hardest man in the territory, and the woman nobody wanted in a corral high on a mountain with the spring coming green around them, and it was not the kiss of any deal that was ever struck. It was the first kiss either of them had been given freely, in longer than either could say asked for, and answered, wanted on both sides. and the young horse beside them blew soft through its nose and did not spook, because there was no fear left in that pen for it to catch only two people who had walked through the worst the world could throw and come out the far side, holding on. They were married again that summer. Not by a circuit preacher in 4 minutes with 2 hired witnesses, but properly by their own choosing when the high passes opened and a real preacher could ride up. And it was a strange thing. A thing the mountain itself seemed to take note of that the news of it had traveled, because old Bill Hardesty came. 60-some years old, and rode 3 days up into the high country, the rancher who'd taken his hat off to her in the stockyard the day she gentled the black, and he stood up as a witness, and afterward, he gripped Gideon's hand and said, "You got the finest hand with stock in the whole territory for a wife, mister. I told her so a year ago, in a stockyard full of fools, too blind to know it. I'm glad somebody finally wasn't blind." And there came a letter too, carried up by Hardesty, and it was from Caleb. Hattie read it standing in the dooryard with Gideon's hand on her shoulder. It was short, and it was clumsy, and it was the closest a small man could come to the truth. He'd hired 2 men, the letter said, and then a third, and they couldn't do what she did, and the stock didn't settle for them, and he'd near lost the livery over the winter, and he was writing to say, and here the words came hard. She could see how hard the pen pressed deep. He was writing to say she'd been right, that she was the best thing ever happened to that livery, that he was sorry, that he hoped she was warm and safe up there, and not what he'd feared dead in the snow with nobody to know. Hattie folded the letter. She looked out a long moment at the mountains that had nearly killed them both, and had instead in the killing, trying, made them. "You gonna write him back?" Gideon asked. "I am." She tucked the letter away. "I'm gonna tell him I'm warm. I'm gonna tell him I'm safe. And I'm gonna tell him I forgive him, 'cause carrying that around is just one more thing the town packed on my back, and I'm done carrying things up this mountain that don't need carrying." She turned to her husband. "But I'm not going back. Not ever. He had 28 years to want me, and he wanted my labor. You had 4 days and you wanted my soul. That's the whole difference in the world, Gideon, and it's all the difference there is." The years came on, and they were good years, and they were hard years, because the mountain was always the mountain, and never once pretended otherwise. But they faced it together, and a thing faced together is a different thing than a thing faced alone. And Gideon Hale, who had spent 11 years, certain that everything he loved would be taken, learned slowly, season by season, to stop bracing for the loss. Because every storm that came, Hattie was there when it cleared. Every winter that tried them, they came out the far side in spring, the 2 of them still holding on. The mountain reached for her 100 times across the years, and never once closed its hand, because some souls are simply too strong and too warm and too stubborn for the cold to keep. And Hattie Mercer was the strongest and warmest and most stubborn of them all. She never breathed hard on the climbs anymore. Her blood had thickened to the high country years back, just as he'd promised that first hard month, and she moved through the thin air now like she'd been born to it. And in a way, she had born to it late, born to it at 28, born the day she walked out of Red Bluff and never looked back. And on the night Gideon Hale finally grew old, and the mountain came at last to take him the gentle way in his own bed, and not in any storm. He was not alone, and he was not cold, and he had not been either one for a very long time. Hattie sat beside him with her strong hand wrapped around his weathered one, the same hand that had lifted a tree and carried him a mile, and set his bone, and held him warm through the longest night, and his eyes found hers, in the lamplight, clear to the last. "You know what you gave me," he said. His voice was a whisper now, but she read it, she read everything. "All them years ago, in that storm, you know what you really gave me." "Tell me," she said. "Tell me one more time." "Everybody I ever loved the mountain took, and I went up high to get away from people, so it couldn't take no more, and all I did was make myself a tomb." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "And then they handed me the woman nobody wanted, and I thought I was doing a charity, the great fool that I was. And you walked into the storm that killed my whole world, and you carried me back out of it on your back, and you gave me—" His breath caught. "You gave me somewhere to live, Hattie. not just to survive, to live. I came down off that mountain, a dead man 11 years walking, and you're the one brought me back to life, and you did it with the very thing they threw you away for, the whole of you. Every bit they called too much. It was exactly enough. It was exactly perfectly just enough. She held his hand until the dawn, the way she'd held him through that first long night, and when his breath finally went slow and deep and even, and then gently stopped, she did not weep the way she'd thought she would across all the years of dreading it. She sat in the morning light with the man who'd wanted her in the home he'd given her on the mountain that had made them, and she understood that the town of Red Bluff had been wrong about her in every particular from the very first day to the very last. They had called her unwanted, and one man had crossed a whole hard winter to want her more than his own life. They had called her unmarriageable, and she had been married twice to the same man, once for a deal and once for love, and the second marriage had outlasted everything the mountain could throw at it. They had called her a burden, and she had been the one who carried him, lifted him, warmed him, saved him twice and 3 times and across a lifetime, the strongest soul on the whole mountain, the warmest hearth in the whole high country. Hattie Mercer had spent 28 years being told that her worth was a thing the world got to measure, and the world had measured her small. And then she had climbed up where the world couldn't reach, and she had learned the truth that the high cold places teach a soul. If it survives them, that worth is not size, and value is not beauty, and love is not permission granted by a town full of fools. Love is recognition. Love is being seen whole and entire by the one set of eyes wise enough to look. And love is being the one who walks into the storm. She lived many more years on that mountain, and she was never once lonely, because a woman who has been truly seen even a single time carries that seeing in her forever, and Hattie carried Gideon Hale in her till her own last day. And when folks down in the valley spoke of her in the after years, the way folks will, they did not speak of the heifer or the joke or the burden. That woman was gone dead in a blue norther long ago, and good riddance. They spoke instead of the legend of the high country, the great strong woman who gentled any horse that breathed and feared no storm that blew, who'd carried a grown man down a mountain on her back and brought him back from the dead with the warmth of her own body, the finest hand with stock the territory ever knew or ever would. They had thrown away the best of them, and the mountain had taken what the town discarded and made of her something the town could never have imagined and never deserved. Not a burden to be tolerated, not a charity to be pitied, but a woman chosen wholly and freely and forever, not despite a single thing. She was, but because of all of it. Hattie Mercer was wanted. In the end, against a whole world that swore she never could be, she was wanted, and she was home, and she was loved, and no power on earth or on that hard high mountain ever took it from her again.